Sahel Breakaway, Why Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso Quit the Francophonie and What It Means for Africa. Welcome to the Bold African Voice, BAV, where we challenge power, amplify truth, and shape Africa's narrative. I'm Abdul Karim Kargbo, born and raised in Africa. Today, we unpacked a seismic shift shaking the Sahel and beyond. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have pulled out of the Francophonie. What does this mean for Africa's future, and are we witnessing the rebirth of African sovereignty? In a bold and symbolic move that signals a growing rift between certain Francophone African countries and their former colonial power, France, the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, have formally announced their withdrawal from the Organization Internationale de la Francophonie, OIF. This move, made during a week of global celebration for International Francophonie Day, March 20th, casts a shadow over the spirit of the occasion and raises critical questions about post-colonial identity, linguistic sovereignty, and geopolitical realignment in Africa. The historical significance of the OIF and Niamey's role. Founded in Niamey, Niger on March 20, 1970, the OIF was envisioned as a vehicle for promoting the French language and cultural cooperation among former French colonies and other Francophone countries. Niger's founding role makes its withdrawal especially symbolic. In a letter addressed to diplomats on March 18, 2025, the Nigerian Ministry of Foreign Affairs confirmed its exit from the OIF, following its suspension by the organization in December 2023 after the military coup. Burkina Faso and Mali, similarly, led by military regimes, had already been suspended from the OIF due to coups in 2022 and 2020, respectively. Their joint decision to leave marks a coordinated effort by the AES to sever institutional ties with a structure perceived as an extension of French soft power. According to a spokesperson for the OIF, Aurea K. van de Vega, the departures are regrettable and threaten ongoing programs in education, cultural exchange, and civil society engagement in the region. Source: Radio France Internationale, RFI, and TV5 Monde. A growing pattern of decolonial realignment. The trio's exit from the OIF is part of a larger geopolitical shift. These Sahel nations have expelled French military forces, revised bilateral agreements, and embraced new alliances, particularly with Russia and other non-Western powers. Their military-led governments argue that France's neo-colonial influence, particularly through language, economics, and defense, perpetuates dependency and undermines sovereignty. The decision to quit the OIF aligns with the January 2024 announcement by the same AES bloc to withdraw from ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States. That move cited similar motivations: perceived French manipulation of ECOWAS decisions, sanctions on military regimes, and imbalanced regional leadership dynamics. In an official communiqué, Malian authorities emphasized that the OIF's values no longer reflect the aspirations of the people, highlighting a shift towards nationalism and cultural autonomy over linguistic fraternity. Source: Nigerian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, 2025, communiqué. Africa-wide comparison: a fractured Francophone bloc? While Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso are turning away from the Francophonie framework, other Francophone African nations like Cameroon, Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Benin, and Togo remain active and engaged in OIF programs. These countries, often considered more stable democracies or semi-authoritarian regimes with strong economic ties to France, continue to benefit from OIF-sponsored initiatives in education, cultural diplomacy, and multilateral development. For instance, in Cameroon, slam poetry, a Francophone cultural form, is thriving. Artists like Jean-Claude Awono of La Ronde des Poètes highlight how French serves not just as a colonial legacy, but as a creative medium of self-expression and social healing. Source: RFI Yaoundé Correspondent, March 2025. However, the AES withdrawal might embolden other dissatisfied Francophone nations to reconsider their membership, if they too feel marginalized or coerced. Chad, Central African Republic, and Guinea, which have experienced political upheavals and fluctuating relations with France, could be next to challenge the OIF's relevance. Critical analysis, language or leverage. The OIF presents itself as a cultural and linguistic alliance, but critics argue it functions as an instrument of French geopolitical strategy, especially in Africa. The language it promotes, French, is not merely a medium of communication, but also a vehicle of influence, shaping educational systems, legal frameworks, and media in member countries. By withdrawing from the OIF, AES nations are rejecting France's symbolic dominion over their linguistic identity and asserting the right to define their national narratives. The move also reflects the rising appeal of Pan-Africanist ideologies, which emphasize indigenous languages, regional integration, and multipolar partnerships over colonial ties. Still, the loss of OIF programs could have tangible consequences for citizens in these countries, especially in areas like youth literacy, women's empowerment, digital education, and cultural exchange, all of which have been historically supported by Francophonie funding. A forward-looking approach. What comes next? The AES states must now grapple with the institutional vacuum left by their OIF exit. Key questions arise. 1. Will they develop their own Sahel-focused linguistic and cultural organization, possibly integrating Fulfulde, Hausa, Bambara, and other native languages into education and media policies? 2. Can Russian or Chinese partnerships offer equivalent cultural and educational benefits, or will their support be limited to military and economic domains? 3. Will this wave of exits inspire reform within the OIF, making it less Paris-centric and more responsive to African voices? The next 6 months will be crucial. According to international diplomatic norms, withdrawal from the OIF becomes effective 6 months after notification. This means the AES countries are technically still members until September 2025, providing room for diplomatic negotiations, internal reassessments, or even collective restructuring of Francophonie frameworks in West Africa. Moreover, France's response remains muted, though behind-the-scenes diplomacy is likely underway. President Emmanuel Macron, who recently hosted a Francophonie summit to revive French influence in the Global South, may now need to rethink France's Africa policy altogether. A new chapter in the Sahel's post-colonial journey. The withdrawal of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso from the Organization Internationale de la Francophonie marks more than a diplomatic reshuffling. It symbolizes a deepening shift in African consciousness, where sovereignty is increasingly defined not just by territorial control, but by cultural autonomy, linguistic freedom, and geopolitical independence. Whether this leads to lasting development or deeper isolation will depend on the AES states' ability to build credible, inclusive, and forward-looking national systems that uplift their people beyond the shadow of their colonial past. Reimagining education and culture. Post-Francophonie, opportunities and risks. With the official withdrawal clock ticking, the alliance of Sahel States, AES, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso must now articulate a clear post-Francophonie roadmap, especially in the sectors of education, media, and cultural preservation. These are areas previously heavily influenced by OIF programs, where the French language has long dominated the curriculum and national discourse. In the short term, the absence of Francophonie support may result in gaps in teacher training, textbook provision, cultural exchange, and youth-oriented media programming. However, it also presents an unprecedented opportunity for these nations to decolonize their educational systems, placing indigenous languages and local knowledge systems at the heart of national identity. Local language integration, a double-edged sword. Many education experts have long argued that teaching children in their mother tongues enhances learning outcomes. According to UNESCO, mother tongue instruction in early education is crucial for cognitive development and literacy. In countries like Niger and Burkina Faso, where French is spoken by a minority of the population outside of urban centers, over-reliance on French has often marginalized local learners. Now that these countries are shedding the Francophonie umbrella, the door is open for language policy reform. For example, Burkina Faso could expand its use of Mooré, Dioula, and Fulfulde in primary education. Mali may prioritize Bambara, a widely spoken national language with an existing literary base. Niger could focus on strengthening Hausa, Zarma, and Tamashek, integrating them more meaningfully into public education and civic life. Yet the transition is not without complications. There are limited educational materials and trained teachers for many local languages, and adopting a multilingual education policy requires significant investment, curriculum development, and standardization efforts. Without international support, this could strain already fragile national budgets, cultural sovereignty, and the media narrative. Cultural institutions in these countries have historically relied on OIF grants and partnerships for festivals, library development, film projects, and youth initiatives. With the withdrawal, there is a vacuum of funding for cultural industries unless alternative sponsors or internal mechanisms are developed. In response, the AES states are exploring cultural revitalization initiatives rooted in pre-colonial traditions, including the revival of indigenous storytelling formats, dance, and theater as part of national celebrations, the establishment of state-backed media houses producing content in local languages and focusing on Pan-African narratives, partnerships with non-Western media and cultural institutions such as Russia's RT, China's CCTV, or Turkey's TRT Africa, which may offer financial backing and technical support. However, the risk of ideological capture cannot be ignored. Aligning too closely with non-democratic partners could undermine press freedom, artistic independence, and cultural authenticity, potentially replacing one form of dominance with another. Regional implications. Is an African alternative to OIF possible? The collective action of the AES could catalyze broader movements across Francophone Africa, prompting conversations about whether the continent should develop its own Pan-African linguistic and cultural organization that is not tied to any former colonial power. An African Francophonie alternative, for instance, could promote linguistic plurality, recognizing French, Arabic, Portuguese, English, and indigenous languages equally. Be rooted in African institutions like the African Union or ECOWAS, despite AES withdrawal from the latter, to ensure continental ownership. Support cultural diplomacy through regional festivals, academic exchanges, and youth innovation labs that reflect African values and experiences. Countries like Senegal and Rwanda, although still in the OIF, have already shown interest in multilingual education policies and diversified diplomatic partnerships. Rwanda, for example, adopted English as an official language in 2008, while retaining French and Kinyarwanda, signaling a pragmatic linguistic policy that prioritizes global competitiveness over linguistic loyalty. Should AES push for a Pan-African cultural alliance, it may find sympathetic ears in nations exploring post-colonial educational models and youth-focused development that reflect the continent's linguistic complexity and cultural dynamism. The future of Francophonie, reform or retreat? For the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, this moment represents both a crisis and a wake-up call. With the loss of 3 major Sahelian members and potential disillusionment in other regions, the OIF must reconsider its strategic relevance in a rapidly evolving Africa. Key reform questions now surface. Will the OIF decentralize its operations to give African member states more decision-making power? Can it detach its identity from France's foreign policy, becoming a truly multilateral cultural body? Will it be able to support populations in suspended or non-member states without compromising its rules or appearing politically biased? According to Aurea K. van de Wege, the OIF still hopes to engage with the populations of these countries, despite state-level withdrawals. This signals a possible shift towards civil society engagement over state diplomacy, which may allow the OIF to maintain soft ties in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. Closing reflections between rebellion and reinvention. The exit of AES countries from the Francophonie is not merely an act of rebellion. It is also a declaration of intent to reimagine African sovereignty in linguistic and cultural terms. As they chart a new path, they will have to strike a delicate balance between nationalistic aspirations and pragmatic cooperation. The journey will be complex, filled with opportunities for transformation, but also pitfalls of isolation. The decisions made in the coming months regarding language policy, media regulation, educational reform, and cultural funding will shape not just their national identities, but could inspire a continental conversation about what it truly means to be African in the 21st century. Strategic realignments, the rise of new international alliances in the Sahel. As Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso turn their backs on the traditional Francophone framework, they are simultaneously embracing new international alliances that reflect a deliberate shift in geopolitical orientation. These realignments signal not only a decline in French influence in the Sahel, but also the emergence of non-Western actors, most notably Russia, China, and Turkey, as alternative strategic partners. This recalibration of foreign partnerships is not occurring in isolation. Rather, it is part of a broader multipolar reconfiguration of global power, where African countries increasingly seek pragmatic cooperation over ideological alignment. For the Sahelian trio, the pivot is driven by the urgent need for security assistance, infrastructure investment, and political legitimacy on the international stage. Russia's expanding footprint, from military to media Russia, has rapidly become a key ally of the AES countries, particularly following their rupture with France and regional blocs like ECOWAS. The presence of Russian military contractors, especially from the Wagner Group, has grown substantially in Mali and Burkina Faso, with similar arrangements reportedly being finalized with Niger. In Mali, Wagner forces are already engaged in joint operations with the Malian army, reportedly providing tactical support against jihadist groups. While critics argue that such partnerships raise concerns over human rights abuses, transparency, and sovereignty erosion, local governments defend them as more reliable and non-interventionist than Western counterparts. Beyond military engagement, Russia is also investing in strategic communication. RT, Russia Today, Africa, has been expanding its French-language broadcasts, filling the information vacuum left by the expulsion or marginalization of French media like RFI and France 24 in these countries. Through this media ecosystem, Moscow is promoting narratives of African self-determination, anti-imperialism, and South-South solidarity, themes that resonate deeply in the Sahel's political climate. China's silent but strategic presence. China's engagement with the AES bloc is less headline-grabbing but no less significant. As the world's largest infrastructure financier, Beijing continues to implement Belt and Road Initiative (BRI) projects across the region, including road networks, energy facilities, and digital infrastructure. In Niger, Chinese companies are completing the Zinder refinery expansion project, while in Burkina Faso, Beijing has resumed the construction of a new presidential palace and national roads. In Mali, China remains the largest trading partner, with steady investments in mining and construction sectors. Importantly, China maintains a policy of non-interference in domestic governance, which makes it an attractive partner for military-led governments facing international isolation. However, critics warn of debt sustainability issues, lack of transparency, and strategic dependency that can emerge from such asymmetrical relationships. Unlike Russia, China does not prioritize ideological influence, instead focusing on economic leverage and long-term strategic positioning, especially in natural resource extraction and digital infrastructure dominance. Turkey's rise as a diplomatic and developmental actor. Turkey, under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has also positioned itself as a rising influence in the Sahel. Through its development agency, TICA, and religious outreach via Diyanet. Turkey has established educational, religious, and health partnerships across West Africa. In 2023, Turkey opened new embassies and consulates in Ouagadougou and Niamey, strengthening diplomatic ties and signing agreements on military cooperation, agriculture, and technical training. Ankara's strategy blends Islamic solidarity, economic diplomacy, and military support, which appeals to the new leaders of the AES. Turkish drones and small arms are reportedly part of new procurement plans for AES defense ministries. Meanwhile, Turkish construction firms have won contracts to rebuild schools and hospitals previously supported by French development aid, which has been suspended or cut following the coups. This growing influence has been welcomed by local authorities but is being closely monitored by regional rivals, including France, which views Ankara's assertiveness in Francophone Africa as a threat to its traditional sphere of influence. Risks of strategic dependency and the multipolar mirage. While the diversification of partnerships offers short-term gains, it also carries strategic risks. The AES countries may escape the conditionalities of Western institutions, but they risk falling into new forms of dependency that are less democratic and more opaque. Russia's support, though framed as solidarity, is often transactional and militarized. China's loans and projects, while substantial, may lead to asset control in case of defaults. Turkey's influence, although culturally aligned, may not fill the broader developmental void left by Francophonie's exit. Furthermore, the lack of coordination between these new partners could create fragmented development, duplication of efforts, and competing spheres of influence in an already fragile region. For the AES bloc to benefit from these relationships, they must establish clear national development plans, strengthen institutional accountability, and ensure public participation in decision-making processes. Without these safeguards, external partnerships could replicate the very imbalances that the Francophonie structure was accused of perpetuating, continental ripple effects, watching eyes across Africa. The decisions of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso are being closely watched across Francophone and non-Francophone Africa alike. In Guinea, which has also experienced a coup and frosty relations with France, there are internal debates over the country's continued engagement with OF and ECOWAS. In Central African Republic, CAR, where Russian support is already entrenched, the government is said to be reassessing its cultural and diplomatic alignments, including its participation in Francophone events. Chad, a country balancing French, Arab, and indigenous cultural identities, faces mounting pressure from youth and civil society to revisit its post-colonial affiliations. Even in more stable Francophone democracies such as Senegal, Benin, and Ivory Coast, there is a growing recognition that the Francophonie must reinvent itself if it hopes to maintain legitimacy among Africa's increasingly assertive youth population. As a new generation demands greater ownership over their language, culture, and development trajectories, the OIF's top-down approach appears increasingly out of step with the times. Internal challenges within the AES bloc, governance, press freedom, and public perception. While Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso seek to redefine their place on the international stage, the internal dynamics within each country raise critical questions about the sustainability of their current political trajectories. The post-coup military regimes are navigating a delicate balancing act, consolidating power, responding to popular frustrations, and delivering on promises of sovereignty, security, and development, all while under the scrutiny of both their citizens and the international community. Press freedom, under pressure. One of the earliest and most visible casualties of the regime changes in these countries has been press freedom. Since the coups, numerous local and international media outlets have faced suspensions, harassment, or outright bans. In Burkina Faso, Radio France Internationale, RFI, and France 24 were taken off air in 2023 after accusations of disinformation and foreign interference. In Mali, journalists have been arrested and interrogated for critical reporting, while independent newspapers struggle to operate under an increasingly hostile environment. Similarly in Niger, after the July 2023 coup, The ruling junta revoked media accreditations for several foreign journalists and suspended domestic broadcasters accused of undermining national unity. The justification offered by the authorities typically frames these actions as efforts to protect national sovereignty and prevent destabilization. However, press watchdogs like Reporters Without Borders, RSF, and Amnesty International have warned that these crackdowns are part of a wider pattern of media repression aimed at consolidating power and limiting dissent. Without free press, it becomes exceedingly difficult to hold transitional governments accountable or foster informed national dialogue on critical reforms, especially as these countries redefine their place beyond Francophonie structures. Civic space shrinking, silencing dissent or maintaining order. Beyond the media, civil society organizations, unions, and activist groups in AES countries have reported growing constraints on their operations. In Mali, for example, civic leaders advocating for democratic transition timelines have been intimidated or surveilled. The junta has also postponed promised elections, originally scheduled for early 2024, citing technical and security concerns. In Burkina Faso, the situation is equally complex. While some grassroots groups initially supported the coup out of frustration with the previous government's inability to contain jihadist violence, many now express concerns that popular mobilization is being manipulated or co-opted by the state. New regulations imposed in 2024 make it harder for NGOs to receive international funding, especially from Western partners. Niger, despite its recent political upheaval, still has pockets of vibrant civic resistance, particularly among youth and women's groups. However, with ECOWAS sanctions, a fractured economy, and declining foreign aid, many civil society actors find themselves financially incapacitated and politically vulnerable. These trends reveal a growing authoritarian tilt within the AES regimes, one that risks undermining the very popular legitimacy they claim to represent. While rhetoric centers on sovereignty and decolonization, the practice increasingly resembles centralized power consolidation, echoing Africa's past experiments with one-party and military rule. Public sentiment, between hope, fear, and fatigue. The street-level perception of the AES regimes is far from uniform. In all three countries, the military takeovers initially garnered significant public support, especially from youth groups and disenfranchised rural populations, who felt betrayed by elite-dominated democratic systems and persistent insecurity. Large crowds welcomed junta leaders upon their ascension. Anti-French protests filled public squares. The slogans were emphatic: "Down with imperialism," "Let Africa be free," "No more neocolonialism." However, as economic hardship deepens, basic services falter, and elections are delayed, enthusiasm is giving way to ambivalence and growing concern. In Mali, inflation and fuel shortages have strained households, and promised infrastructure projects remain incomplete. In Burkina Faso, despite aggressive counterterrorism campaigns, violence in the north and east persists, displacing tens of thousands. Niger, hit by sanctions and diplomatic isolation, is seeing increased food insecurity, especially in already vulnerable border regions. Social media remains a critical space for youth expression, though it is also monitored and occasionally censored. Online debates reflect a society in flux, proud of its resistance to foreign dominance, but anxious about the lack of a clear and inclusive roadmap forward. There are growing calls within these societies for transparency, dialogue with civil actors, and a return to constitutional order, even among those who continue to support the broader vision of African sovereignty and independence from France. The burden of transition, military governments, and the promise of civilian rule. One of the central promises made by the AES juntas was that their leadership would be temporary, a necessary interruption to restore national dignity and stability before returning power to civilians. Yet the timelines for democratic transition remain vague, shifting, or entirely absent. In Mali, the transitional government has postponed elections multiple times. Though a draft constitution was approved in 2023, opposition parties argue that it grants excessive powers to the executive, which may pave the way for a prolonged or permanent military presence in politics. In Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré has suggested that elections are not a priority until the country is fully secure, a condition that could take years to fulfill. He remains popular among some rural communities, but faces increasing criticism from civil society and political opponents. Niger, which had one of West Africa's more stable civilian democracies before the 2023 coup, is at a particularly sensitive crossroads. With ECOWAS sanctions only recently lifted and diplomatic ties slowly reopening, the junta now faces pressure to establish a credible transition plan, or risk further isolation. For all three countries, the longer the transitional military governments remain in place without clear democratic benchmarks, the higher the risk of political stagnation, civil unrest, and legitimacy crises. Education, youth activism, and the diaspora, catalysts for a new political future in the Sahel. Amid the political uncertainty and authoritarian tendencies emerging within the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, one of the most underutilized yet potent forces for transformation lies in the educational system, youth-led movements, and the African diaspora. These three pillars, if engaged strategically, can serve as engines of renewal, enabling these countries to build inclusive political cultures, restore civic trust, and forge sustainable paths forward in a post-Francophonie era. Education, reclaiming minds, reshaping nations. The withdrawal from the Organization Internationale de la Francophonie, OIF, presents both a disruption and a remarkable opportunity for the AES bloc to decolonize and reimagine education. Historically, education systems in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have followed a French colonial legacy, with a curriculum often disconnected from local realities and cultural identities. Now, as the states move away from that framework, educational reform must go beyond changing the language of instruction. It must involve a curriculum overhaul that incorporates indigenous knowledge systems, environmental wisdom, and history told from local perspectives. Civic education fosters critical thinking, constitutional literacy, and citizen participation. Technical and vocational programs tailored to local economies, such as sustainable agriculture, renewable energy, and digital entrepreneurship. In Burkina Faso, some pilot projects led by local NGOs have started integrating Moray and Dioula into primary school curricula alongside civic awareness content, an approach that could be replicated across the AES region. But reforming education requires political will, financial investment, and teacher retraining, all of which are now constrained by shrinking foreign aid, internal insecurity, and the departure from OIF-funded programs. This makes South-South cooperation, including educational exchanges with countries like Ethiopia, Rwanda, South Africa, and Cuba, an avenue worth exploring. Youth activism, a force too powerful to ignore. Over 60% of the population in the Sahel is under the age of 25. This youth bulge represents both a ticking time bomb and a transformative force, depending on whether states choose to engage or suppress it. In the early days of the coups, many youth groups celebrated the fall of what they saw as ineffective civilian elites backed by Western interests. But disillusionment is setting in, especially among urban youth, university students, and job seekers who see little change in material conditions. Yet, this generation is also demonstrating unprecedented digital fluency and political awareness. Across platforms like Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, X, and Telegram, youth are forming decentralized movements that monitor governance, demand accountability, and call for democratic processes, often at great personal risk. In Mali, groups like Ante Abana, We Won't Take It Anymore, have protested delays in elections. In Niger, university unions have criticized cuts to academic programs and demanded a clear roadmap for civilian governance. In Burkina Faso, young environmentalists and bloggers are raising alarms about climate inaction and displacement in conflict zones. Rather than criminalize dissent, the AES governments have an opportunity to institutionalize youth engagement by creating youth councils with legislative influence, investing in youth entrepreneurship and digital innovation hubs, protecting freedom of association and assembly. Suppressing youth activism may buy temporary stability, but empowering it could build legitimacy and resilience for the long term. The diaspora. Brain drain or brain gain? The Sahelian diaspora, particularly in Europe, North America, and other parts of Africa, is another critical but often overlooked actor in shaping the region's future. Historically marginalized from decision-making, the diaspora is now becoming more politically active, financially influential, and digitally connected to home countries. Remittances from the diaspora already account for billions of CFA francs annually, sustaining families and funding small businesses. But beyond financial support, many in the diaspora, including academics, IT professionals, engineers, health workers, and policy experts, are eager to contribute more directly to national development and governance reform. In response to this, the AES states could launch structured programs that create reverse brain drain initiatives, incentivizing diaspora professionals to return short or long term, establish dual citizenship and voting rights reforms to enfranchise the diaspora in political transitions, create diaspora investment trusts to pool capital for community projects, bypassing traditional aid systems. For instance, Mali's High Council for Malians Abroad has started discussions with diaspora groups in France and Canada to co-create development blueprints in education and rural electrification. This model could be scaled across the region, especially if accompanied by anti-corruption safeguards and transparent reporting mechanisms. However, diaspora engagement must also be grounded in equity and accountability, ensuring that returnees do not dominate domestic spaces or replicate elite capture patterns. A continent in conversation. Lessons and leverage from other African states. The transitions unfolding in the AES region are not happening in a vacuum. Across Africa, countries are watching, learning, and in some cases, rethinking their own relationships with colonial legacies, foreign alliances, and governance models. Rwanda, while still a member of the OIF, has long emphasized linguistic diversification, prioritizing Kinyarwanda and English, and building institutions focused on accountability and innovation. Its investment in local languages and civic education stands as a possible reference point for the AES bloc. Ghana, a former British colony, has shown how sustained investment in media freedom, electoral integrity, and youth inclusion can strengthen democratic institutions without external imposition. Ethiopia and Tanzania, though navigating internal political challenges, have invested in language pluralism and self-reliant development frameworks that can offer valuable comparative insights. The African Union, AU, and regional academic institutions, such as CODESRIA, could play a bridging role, helping the AES nations link with continental knowledge networks and governance innovations. Economic resilience in the AES bloc, surviving sanctions, inflation, and food insecurity without traditional aid. As Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso recalibrate their foreign relations and withdraw from international structures like the OIF, the economic implications of these decisions are becoming increasingly urgent. These countries now face the daunting task of building economic resilience amid sanctions, currency instability, rising inflation, and persistent food insecurity, all in the absence of the development aid they once received from Western institutions and Francophonie-affiliated partners. The economic cost of political sovereignty is being felt most acutely by ordinary citizens, particularly in border towns, rural farming communities, and urban informal markets. Despite lofty promises of self-reliance and anti-imperialist renewal, the reality on the ground is marked by shrinking purchasing power, import dependency, and weak regional trade coordination. Sanctions and isolation, a tightening noose. In the aftermath of the military takeovers, ECOWAS imposed a series of sweeping sanctions on the AES countries, including the freezing of state assets in regional central banks, the closure of borders, cutting off trade routes and cross-border commerce, the suspension of financial transfers and regional development financing. Although ECOWAS lifted some of these sanctions in early 2025, particularly against Niger, the initial damage has already taken a toll. Small-scale traders who rely on interstate markets saw their livelihoods collapse overnight, while national governments struggled to meet basic import demands due to currency shortages. These challenges have been compounded by international donors, including the European Union, World Bank, and IMF, either suspending or conditioning aid, pending political transitions and governance benchmarks. In this context, AES countries are increasingly turning to alternative partners such as China, Russia, Iran, and Gulf states for trade, energy, and investment. But these relationships are strategic, bilateral, and limited in scale, often not structured to address grassroots economic needs. Inflation and currency dependence, the CFA franc conundrum. A central contradiction in the AES anti-French narrative is the continued use of the CFA franc, a currency tightly linked to the French treasury and used by 8 West African states through the West African Economic and Monetary Union, UEMOA. Although the rhetoric from AES capitals has called for monetary independence, none of the countries have yet formally withdrawn from UEMOA or introduced a sovereign currency. The risks of exiting the CFA zone are immense, including capital flight and currency devaluation, increased transaction costs for regional trade, immediate shocks to already fragile foreign exchange reserves. However, inflation is already surging, partly due to disrupted supply chains and rising import costs. In Burkina Faso, inflation hit 18% in early 2025, the highest in a decade, while Niger experienced a food price surge of over 30% in major markets like Niamey and Maradi. Without strong monetary policy levers or diversified trade networks, the AES countries are vulnerable to external shocks and commodity price volatility, which could trigger deeper socioeconomic unrest. That said, there are growing policy discussions, particularly among technocrats in Mali and Burkina Faso, about exploring regional monetary alternatives or adopting digital financial innovations to reduce dependence on the CFA. Still, such proposals remain embryonic and politically sensitive. Food security, from vulnerability to local solutions. Perhaps the most acute challenge facing the AES countries is food insecurity, worsened by climate change, internal displacement, conflict, and the breakdown of cross-border trade. According to the World Food Programme, WFP, over 10 million people across the Sahel face acute food insecurity, with Niger and Burkina Faso classified among the highest risk zones. The withdrawal of Western aid programs has further strained emergency response mechanisms. However, each country has also begun localizing food production strategies, including Mali's Green Sahel program, aimed at promoting dryland farming techniques and supporting millet and sorghum production. Burkina Faso's Agro-Populaire initiative, which encourages youth-led agriculture cooperatives with state-subsidized inputs. Niger's community grain banks, designed to reduce dependency on volatile market prices during the lean season. There's also a growing focus on seed sovereignty, with researchers and activists promoting indigenous seed varieties and traditional irrigation techniques that are more climate resilient than imported agricultural models. Yet challenges persist: limited access to financing, poor rural infrastructure, land insecurity, and the looming impact of armed conflict on farming zones. For these local solutions to scale, AES countries will need to deepen regional agricultural cooperation, harmonize land tenure policies, and reduce dependency on foreign fertilizers and imported grains, especially rice and wheat, which continue to dominate urban consumption patterns. Toward economic self-determination, is the AES bloc building a new development model? Despite the mounting challenges, there is a genuine attempt within the AES bloc to break from the donor-recipient development model and experiment with self-determined, endogenous growth strategies. Key priorities emerging from national policy dialogues include resource sovereignty, reclaiming control over gold, uranium, and agricultural land from foreign multinationals. In Mali, for instance, the government recently renegotiated mining contracts with Canadian and South African firms to increase state revenue shares. Industrialization. Burkina Faso's pilot program to process cotton domestically rather than exporting raw material has shown early promise, though it requires capital investment and regional markets. Digital transformation. Niger's Ministry of Innovation is rolling out mobile money expansion programs to support informal traders and rural women's cooperatives, leveraging partnerships with African fintech startups. These ideas, though still in formation, represent an attempt to build a post-aid, people-centered development model grounded in national dignity, economic justice, and regional solidarity. Beyond ECOWAS, toward a Sahel Economic and Defense Union, with their coordinated withdrawal from ECOWAS and increasingly assertive rejections of Francophone institutions, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso are laying the groundwork for what some analysts are calling a Sahel sovereignty bloc. This alliance, rooted in shared geopolitical frustrations and a vision for regional self-determination, is evolving beyond symbolism into what may become a new economic and defense union, one that could reshape the balance of power in West Africa. The Alliance of Sahel States, AES, formalized in 2023 through the Liptako-Gourma Charter, initially focused on mutual security cooperation. However, in recent months, there has been a marked shift toward institutionalizing joint economic strategies, military coordination, and foreign policy alignment separate from traditional regional organizations perceived as compromised or dominated by external powers. The foundations of the Sahel Economic Union. In early 2025, the AES announced the creation of a joint technical committee tasked with exploring the establishment of a Sahel Economic Framework, SEF, a platform that could eventually evolve into a monetary and trade union. The objectives, as stated in a communiqué issued by Burkina Faso's Ministry of Finance, include facilitating cross-border trade between the three countries with harmonized customs protocols and transport infrastructure investment, promoting a regional agricultural strategy to ensure collective food security and reduce import dependency, exploring a shared currency or digital financial system independent of the CFA franc and the French Treasury, establishing a common investment fund to pool resources for key infrastructure projects. Already, there are pilot projects underway, such as a tri-country road and rail corridor connecting Bamako, Mali, Niamey, Niger, and Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, partially funded by non-Western partners. Joint procurement agreements for agricultural machinery and fuel, intended to reduce individual reliance on fluctuating global markets. The planning of a Sahelian stock exchange, as proposed by financial advisors in Bamako, which would allow small businesses and cooperatives to access capital from across the bloc. Though these projects remain in the early stages, their existence signals a serious intent to build an integrated economic zone tailored to the specific realities of the Sahel. A unified security architecture, the Sahel Joint Force. Perhaps the most developed pillar of AES cooperation is in the defense and security sector. After the collapse of the G5 Sahel Joint Force, an initiative previously supported by France and the EU, the AES states moved quickly to reconstitute their alliance through a fully independent military pact. Under the Liptako-Gourma Security Agreement, the three nations now operate a coordinated military command with joint operations along shared borders to combat jihadist insurgencies and transnational criminal networks. This includes intelligence sharing and real-time coordination during counterterrorism operations, creation of interoperable rapid response units, combining troops from all three countries, establishment of joint military academies to train officers in doctrine aligned with national sovereignty and regional autonomy. Moreover, the AES has signed bilateral defense cooperation agreements with Russia, Turkey, and Iran, which include technical training, drone acquisition, and arms supplies, reducing their dependence on Western military assistance. However, Critics argue that the militarization of regional cooperation could sideline civilian oversight and undermine democratic accountability. There are also concerns about human rights abuse and non-compliance with international humanitarian norms, especially in conflict zones. Nonetheless, for the military regimes in power, the Sahel Joint Force is as much a political statement as it is a security mechanism. It projects their determination to defend sovereignty by force, if necessary, without relying on France, ECOWAS, or even the African Union. Reactions from the region: anxiety and opportunity. The formation of a potential Sahel Economic and Defense Union has drawn mixed reactions from neighboring countries. In Ghana, Nigeria, and Senegal, policymakers are closely watching developments with a combination of apprehension and strategic interest. There is fear that the AES model may embolden other dissatisfied or militarized states to break from ECOWAS or challenge its legitimacy. The bloc's appeal to nationalistic sentiment, sovereignty, and anti-Western rhetoric resonates with some civil society actors and youth movements in other parts of Africa, especially in countries grappling with elite corruption, foreign influence, and security fragility. At the same time, some leaders see an opportunity to engage pragmatically with the AES bloc. Algeria, for example, has expressed interest in deepening diplomatic and trade ties with the alliance, given shared security concerns and energy linkages. Even non-African actors are recalibrating. Russia is investing in military logistics across the Sahel. China is adjusting its Belt and Road priorities to include AES-backed infrastructure, and Turkey is expanding embassy staff and commercial missions in Ouagadougou and Niamey. This emerging bloc may soon force continental institutions like the AU to confront their internal contradictions. If the AU continues to exclude or sanction military-led governments, it risks becoming irrelevant in shaping the post-coup transition debates. If it chooses to engage, it must do so without appearing to legitimize authoritarianism, a delicate diplomatic balancing act, toward a new continental order. The momentum behind the AES bloc reflects a tectonic shift in Africa's post-colonial order. For decades, regional integration efforts were shaped by inherited boundaries, donor-driven frameworks, and elite multilateralism. What is emerging now in the Sahel is a bottom-up, sovereignty-centered, and militarized model of regionalism, controversial, contested, yet undeniably influential. Whether this model results in durable development, inclusive governance, and continental solidarity, or simply entrenches new forms of isolationism and authoritarianism, remains to be seen. But what is clear is that the AES countries are no longer content to be peripheral actors in other people's visions for Africa. They are trying, for better or worse, to author their own future. Pan-Africanism and the AES model, realignment or rupture. As Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso chart a path of sovereign redefinition, their actions are beginning to challenge the foundational ideals of Pan-Africanism, as championed by continental institutions like the African Union, AU. While the AES bloc claims to be acting in the spirit of African unity, resisting neo-colonialism and foreign domination, their methods and governance structures are raising fundamental tensions with the institutionalized vision of Pan-African integration. At the heart of the matter lies a philosophical and strategic contradiction. Can a regional bloc led by military governments, disengaging from continental frameworks and aligning with non-African powers, truly uphold the principles of Pan-Africanism, or is it redefining them for a new, post-liberal era? Historical foundations: Pan-Africanism as unity through democracy. The modern Pan-African movement, built upon the ideals of Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Sekou Touré, and Haile Selassie, emphasized African solidarity, self-governance, cultural pride, and democratic liberation. These ideals became embedded in the Constitutive Act of the African Union, which explicitly commits member states to uphold democratic principles, good governance, and constitutional rule. Promote regional economic integration through instruments like the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA. Protect human rights, press freedom, and civic participation. In this context, the military-led sovereignty-first approach of the AES bloc appears at odds with AU norms. All three countries have been suspended from AU decision-making bodies, and their leaders are barred from continental summits. The AU Peace and Security Council has expressed concern about the erosion of democratic norms in the Sahel and has urged swift transitions to constitutional order. Yet, from the perspective of the AES governments, the AU's stance is hypocritical and outdated, seen as an elite club beholden to foreign donors and unwilling to accommodate alternative pathways to African sovereignty. The clash of visions, Afro-realism versus Afro-idealism. What is now unfolding across the continent is a clash between Afro-realism and Afro-idealism. Afro-realism, as embodied by the AES, argues that democracy in its current form has been compromised by foreign manipulation, elite capture, and security failures. It prioritizes stability, sovereignty, and cultural autonomy, even at the cost of liberal democratic norms. Afro-idealism, represented by the AU and democratic African states, envisions an Africa led by people-powered institutions, with continental integration, open borders, and collective diplomacy. The question facing African citizens and leaders today is whether these two visions can coexist and converge, or whether they are on a collision course. In countries like Guinea, Sudan, and Chad, where military actors and transitional governments have also challenged AU norms, the AES model is gaining quiet support. Even within civilian governments, there is growing criticism that the AU lacks enforcement capacity, ignores grassroots concerns, and imposes rigid structures that do not reflect Africa's diversity of political thought. Some Pan-African intellectuals are now calling for a reform of Pan-Africanism itself, one that moves beyond the binary of democracy versus dictatorship and embraces contextualized governance models, provided they uphold justice, self-reliance, and popular legitimacy. The African Union at a crossroads, reform or irrelevance. The growing influence of the AES bloc puts the African Union in a difficult position. Its authority depends on moral credibility and consensus, yet it is now faced with a bloc of countries that reject its frameworks, operate outside its treaties, claim to speak for a disenfranchised African majority. In recent AU summits, several proposals have been floated to reform the continental body, including creating a tiered membership system where suspended states retain partial access to technical cooperation but are excluded from leadership positions. Establishing a continental transition support unit that works with military regimes to create credible roadmaps rather than imposing blanket suspensions. Broadening AU representation to include youth movements, diaspora associations, and civil society coalitions, making it more grassroots-driven. However, such reforms face resistance from entrenched political elites and bureaucrats who benefit from the current structure. The risk is that if the AU does not adapt, it could lose relevance, especially among Africa's rising generations, who increasingly view the AES model, flawed as it may be, as more responsive to their frustrations. Pan-Africanism redefined toward a multipolar African future. The AES bloc is arguably ushering in a new era of Pan-Africanism, one rooted in multipolarity, resistance, and self-determination, but also characterized by fragile institutions, contested legitimacy, and geopolitical opportunism. This reimagined Pan-Africanism may no longer rely on continental consensus or Western validation. Instead, it could be forged through strategic alliances with non-traditional partners, such as BRICS nations, cultural revivalism centered on indigenous languages, histories, and governance, South-South cooperation with Latin America, Asia, and other regions facing similar post-colonial challenges, digital Pan-Africanism, where youth connect across borders using technology to challenge old power structures. Whether this version of Pan-Africanism can deliver inclusive prosperity, peace, and empowerment, or whether it will devolve into authoritarian fragmentation, depends largely on citizen engagement, institutional reform, and leadership accountability, both within the AES bloc and across the continent. Culture as resistance, indigenous knowledge, language sovereignty, and identity building. In the heart of the Sahel, the withdrawal from the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, OIF, and the broader rejection of French influence are not only political gestures, they are also cultural revolutions. Across Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, a deep movement is emerging to reclaim language, history, spirituality, and traditional knowledge as sources of pride and power. This movement seeks to reshape African identity from the grassroots, using culture as a weapon of resistance and a foundation for sovereignty. Language sovereignty and the rebirth of the African tongue. One of the clearest manifestations of this cultural shift is the increasing call for language sovereignty. While French remains the official language in all three AES countries, its dominance is now being openly challenged by campaigns to promote indigenous languages, such as Bambara, Mali, Moré, Burkina Faso, and Hausa, or Zarma, Niger. Local NGOs, teachers' unions, and youth organizations are advocating for mother tongue education, especially in early childhood learning, state media broadcasting in local languages, promoting inclusive political debate, cultural festivals and literary competitions that celebrate oral traditions, proverbs, and ancestral storytelling. In Mali, the Ministry of National Education recently announced a pilot program to roll out Bambara-based literacy modules in rural schools. In Burkina Faso, local radio stations have started airing weekly current affairs programs entirely in indigenous languages, helping bridge the gap between the state and the people. This linguistic revival is more than symbolic. It affirms that true liberation cannot occur in the language of the oppressor. It also recognizes that communication, governance, and education must begin with the people's own voice. Indigenous knowledge systems, reconnecting with African epistemologies beyond language. There is a renewed interest in indigenous knowledge systems, from agriculture to conflict resolution, from herbal medicine to environmental conservation. Traditional farming methods, like zai planting in Burkina Faso or floodplain rice cultivation in Niger, are being revalorized as sustainable alternatives to imported technologies. Community-based conflict resolution, often led by elders or spiritual leaders, is being used in parallel with state structures in rural Mali to mediate disputes and reduce intercommunal violence. African spirituality, long demonized during colonialism and often sidelined by foreign religions, is slowly reclaiming space through cultural centers, traditional rites, and public discourse. These movements seek to decolonize not just governance, but thought itself, resisting Eurocentric definitions of development, science, and civilization. Final reflections, a fork in Africa's road. The withdrawal of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso from the Francophonie is not an isolated event. It is a symptom of a deeper crisis and opportunity facing the African continent today. The AES bloc, by defying traditional Western alignments and attempting to construct a new path, has sparked a continental conversation about what it truly means to be sovereign, African, and free. But this journey is riddled with contradictions. Can sovereignty be real without democracy? Can military rule deliver lasting peace and prosperity? Can cultural revival coexist with political repression? And can African unity endure if institutions like ECOWAS and the AU are undermined or abandoned? These are the questions now confronting African citizens, thinkers, and leaders alike. Advice to African leaders: choose sovereignty with accountability. To the leaders of the AES bloc and beyond, the message is clear. 1. Sovereignty is not a slogan. It is a social contract. True independence must come with inclusive governance, respect for civil liberties, and accountability to the people. 2. Rejecting neo-colonial structures is justified, but building credible alternatives is essential. Pan-Africanism cannot thrive without cooperation, transparency, and shared vision. 3. Invest in education, youth, and culture. These are the building blocks of long-term sovereignty. Armed power may secure borders, but only educated, empowered citizens can secure nations. 4. Engage the diaspora and civil society. Africa's strength lies not in military alliances alone, but in the creativity, resilience, and wisdom of its people, both at home and abroad. 5. Reform continental institutions. Rather than abandon the AU or ECOWAS, push for their transformation. Make them more democratic, more African, and more aligned with grassroots realities. Summary of key messages. The withdrawal of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso from the Francophonie reflects a broader anti-neocolonial realignment in West Africa. The AES bloc is attempting to build new models of economic and defense cooperation, cultural sovereignty, and geopolitical independence. However, these efforts are fraught with internal contradictions, especially regarding democracy, media freedom, and civic participation. Africa is now witnessing a redefinition of Pan-Africanism, one that demands unity through diversity, not conformity. The future of African independence will depend not only on resisting external control, but on building inclusive, accountable, and culturally rooted systems from within. As the drums of a new era beat louder in the Sahel and beyond, the question remains: will Africa rise as one, or fragment in pursuit of many incomplete freedoms? The choice lies with its leaders. The future lies with its people. Thank you for watching. This is more than a withdrawal. It's a declaration. The Sahel is speaking, and the world must listen. Will Africa unite in purpose or divide in pursuit of power? The journey ahead demands courage, clarity, and bold voices like yours. Subscribe to the Bold African Voice, BAV, where Africa tells her own story. One voice, one future, one continent. Until next time, stay informed, stay bold, and stay African.